Good morning and welcome to this latest ZC3 Thought Leaders webinar. Many thanks to you all for attending. The aim of these webinars, which Mobility Waves typically hosts fortnightly, is to support sustainability learning and invite collaboration on decarbonisation topics. For those new to Mobility Waves, we are a leader in transport decarbonisation and the leader in tackling commuting emissions through our comprehensive Measure, Reduce, Report framework. Through tech-enabled tools and data-led processes, Mobility Waves helps organisations reduce carbon and deliver operational improvement, particularly in areas relating to estate management, resourcing, inclusion, and employee well-being. My name is Graham Bannister, and I lead Mobility Waves interactions across several sectors, including councils, construction, and consultancies. And so, to today's webinar, International Lessons for Increasing Public Transport Uptake in the UK. I'm joined today by Rollison, External Affairs Manager at Centre for Cities. Centre for Cities is the leading think tank dedicated to improving the economies of the UK's largest cities and towns, and I'm delighted and thankful for Caitlin agreeing to participate in this webinar. I will leave Caitlin to fully introduce herself and the activities of Centre for Cities in her presentation. However, for context, this webinar came to be after I read Gear Shift, a report by Centre for Cities published in November 2023, which really struck a chord personally and professionally. For me, it is perhaps the clearest study linking commuting and sustainable travel and what can be achieved economically and environmentally if people swap from cars to public transport. Hence my interest and my quest to have Centre for Cities join one of our webinars. Caitlin will present for around 30 minutes, leaving adequate time for questions. Please do add these questions, queries, general comments, etc., as they come to you via the Q&A function. If we don't get to all questions and queries during the webinar, we will follow up over email. Plus, with this session being recorded, a link to the video will be circulated to all, so no need to spend the next hour making notes and snipping slides. So just before handing over to Caitlin, a couple of slides from me to set the scene on why this report and the topic is so important. As you can see from the slide, it clearly articulates that domestic transport is a problem, accounting now for 28% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. In this time frame between 1990 and now, domestic transport has decreased the least, and obviously between 21 and 22, it's increased the most. Now, there are some factors within here. Electricity supply actually there's been a good job in terms of decarbonising electricity supply, moving to renewables. But domestic transport, it's a problem. Transport emissions are pretty much back to levels seen pre-COVID, and all forecasts point to increasing emission levels and in parallel, increasing congestion. This, despite some changes to working practices, i.e. a continuation of hybrid working. What we're seeing is that there is work to be done to tackle transport emissions and deliver a reduction in vehicle miles driven, a key metric in local transport plans. I mentioned earlier the additional benefits of decarbonising transport. There are several. Next slide. As you can see from this slide, so the work that we do with organisations tends to start and commence on a sustainability angle. So how can we support an organisation with its net zero targets, its sustainability objectives? Commuting and business travel are both transport-related Scope 3 emissions. With our focus on commuting, we're here to help clients meet their net zero targets. But beyond that, there is a whole lot, and I mentioned it previously, activity around operational opportunity. Clearly, cost of living is persistent, whilst we're seeing some decreases in inflation, in headline inflation. Perhaps that's not finding its way through to the shops right now. Actually, cost of living is tough. There is cheaper ways for people to travel. There is just a need for that to be more consistently promoted throughout society. And associated with cost of living is also well-being. So there is a great opportunity here for advancing the mobility hierarchy, getting more people to walk, wheel, take public transport, shared transport, and there are well-being benefits associated with that. And a big part from an operational perspective is recruitment and retention. A big part, and I mentioned it as well previously, inclusion. a really hot topic right now in terms of equality and fairness when it comes to accessing skills and work. There are circa 20% of people who can't drive and don't drive. So particularly if it's an organisation that is difficult to reach, you are in effect in a position where there are people who can't work for you. So how can you turn this round to get this into a position where actually through tackling commuting and understanding better transport opportunities, you can actually turn this into a position whereby you can actually support and improve resourcing strategy. Next slide. Just a little bit in terms of our credentials. So we've already been helping a large amount of employers on their decarbonisation of transport. We've saved a whole load of commuting miles and we'll continue to do that year in, year out. A big chunk of what we do is obviously behaviour change. I mentioned that domestic transport is a sticky one in terms of being quite stubborn to reduce. This is a huge part of this is behaviour change and breaking habits. And we've been doing this for 25 years. But we're not resting on our laurels. We're continually looking to improve the ways that we do this. Our whole service is tech enabled. So we're continually investing in the tools to help support and drive changes in behaviour that lead to an advancement in sustainable travel. And we're keen to look and see how we can do this across businesses. So the bulk of our focus has been large organisations, but we're looking for ways that we can start to deliver our services into smaller and mid-sized enterprises. Okay, so that's enough of an introduction. Hopefully that's given you the context. Over to Caitlin to give us the lowdown on Gearshift.
Good morning. I hope you can all hear me, and thank you very much to Graham and the rest of the team at Mobility Ways for inviting me and for making this so organised and smooth. Next slide, please. Oh, and the next one. Amazing, thank you. So I just wanted to start by giving you a little bit more background to build on that intro about who we are at Centre of Cities and how we're going to approach talking about transport and specifically modal shift for commuting today. So as Graham said, we're a fully independent, non-partisan think tank dedicated to helping the UK cities and towns realise their economic potential. And within that, we cover 63 cities across the UK. So that covers 4 in Scotland, 3 in Wales, 1 in Northern Ireland, and the rest are in England. And we define cities using something called primary urban areas. And these are essentially the urban areas that function, as cities. So for example, for London, our definition of London, that primary urban area includes Surrey. If you look at Birmingham, it includes Solihull, so on and so forth. So those are the areas that people kind of think about as where they live and work. And we focus primarily on data-driven research covering all sorts of themes relating to cities. And as you can see from the chart on the right, cities, obviously we would say this, cities are very important. They account for just 9% of land, but if you look into these categories, they're performing an outsized role in the UK economy, both kind of on what would typically be considered the positive side of things. So that's high-skilled residents, new economy firms. So those are firms doing kind of innovative R&D activities, business startups, value added, knowledge-intensive business services jobs. They also account for 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, which we'll come on to a little bit later in the presentation. So they're going to have a key role in accelerating the transition to net zero. And you're going to be seeing a lot more charts, a lot more graphs and maps throughout this presentation. But I want to say from the outset, I am actually the leader of our kind of external affairs activities here at the centre, and I worked with a colleague to do the charts for this. So if you have any specific methodology questions, if you'd like to really dig into the analysis and the data work done in this project, please do send me an email using the contact details that you'll find on the first slide when Mobility Waves send them out, and we will get back to you because I am definitely not the best person to answer all of your kind of big data questions. And then just in terms of our activities outside of research, we run events online and around the country. We have a regular blog and podcast series, and the links for those will all be at the end as well. So next slide, please. So obviously we're an urban economics think tank. So you might be wondering why we think so much about transport, because this is just one in a series of reports we've done on transport, both nationally and focusing on specific cities around the country. As Graham already touched on, transport connectivity is really important for the economy. It's what allows lots of people to get to work, and it also increases the pool of skilled workers that companies can hire from, which I think is what Graham was touching on when he talked about recruitment and retention. So the more people that can easily get to a place, the more kind of high-skilled workers employers have to choose from. And then, obviously, as you all know, public transport is really important for access to education and training. Day to day, you need public transport, or a lot of people will, to reach their friends, family, and amenities. And that also goes for services like hospitals, and businesses and logistics also rely on public transport, or rather they rely on the networks within cities functioning effectively. So that means kind of no congestion. They need to know timings, things like that. And I suspect the audience for this webinar is possibly not thinking, why can't we drive? Or what about EVs? But just to touch on that, obviously EVs are going to play a key role in the transition to net zero, and it is something we should be thinking about, but it is not kind of the be-all end-all solution, especially when it comes to cities. And that's because when you have a dense population, there simply is not the space for private transport, traditional or EV. So if you look here, at 30 miles an hour, one car requires 28 more times space than a cyclist and 70 times as much as a pedestrian. And you need all of that car parking, all of that storage space for those things. So the more vehicles you have, even if they're EVs, the more congestion you're going to have. And EVs as well, they still emit particulate matter and cause local air pollution. And then not everyone is going to have access to a car. And that's especially true when you talk about EVs, which are obviously still much more expensive than regular cars. So by relying on private transport, you're putting the least well-off groups in society at a further disadvantage. So next slide, please. And then coming back to some of the other themes that Graham touched on, cities are going to have a really important role in reducing our transport emissions, and that's nationally, over the coming years. So if you look at these three graphs, you'll see that transport emissions have fallen more slowly than other categories of emissions from cities. So if you look at industry and domestic, they've fallen pretty rapidly from 2005 to, I think these are to 2021, yeah. And you'll see that little V at the end. That's where COVID had an impact on our emissions. And the reason that transport is falling slower is partly, and I think Graham touched on this as well, that kind of industry has moved out of our cities, and you've seen overall decarbonisation of the grid, which means domestic emissions are lowering. The same can't be said for transport. And although I introduced at the beginning that cities account for just 9% of land, but 40% of our emissions, if you look at per capita, overall emissions are actually lower. It's because they have such a dense population that per person emissions are lower. So this is a really kind of positive thing for cities. It means they have a lot of potential to kind of make further gains on emissions reduction. This is especially true, and we're going to go into this a bit more deeply later, because public transport is inherently easier to provide in these dense areas. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we come to some of the content from our gear shift report that's forming the base of this presentation, and kind of what we really focus on here at the center, which is that data-driven comparative research. So obviously the premise for this is that ridership in the UK has been declining for years, and it's not just a post-COVID phenomenon. And I think it's really important to remember that. So when we're talking about modal shift, we're not just talking about pandemic recovery. You need to look much further back and at much kind of bigger structural problems. And it's not just that it's declining, it's also from a low baseline. So our transport ridership is fairly low when you compare us with European cities. So what we did was we looked at 25 European cities with large populations, so that's over 600,000 people. And out of the 25 cities sampled, 6 of the bottom 9 for public transport usage, that share of commutes using public transport, are UK cities. And you can see that London, fourth from the left on the chart, is really the only one where you're getting comparable levels of public transport commuting. So in London, you have 46% of people using public transport to commute. And then that actually rises up to 80% if you look at just at people working in central London, plus a further 10% who are walking on cycling. So it's really high. Then when you look at the far right of the chart, only 16% of people in Birmingham and Manchester are commuting using public transport compared to kind of their European counterparts like Hamburg, which is 40%, or Lyon, which is 33%. And obviously we're an economic think tank. So if you look into the economics of this, it's actually contributing to a productivity gap because of that smaller labor pool. So what this means is our cities, they might have the same population, but they actually have a smaller effective size. That's the number of people who can reach the city centre in 30 minutes. That's that labor pool when it comes to commuting. And if we were to bring those ridership levels up to European levels, we would actually add around 23.1 billion in productivity gains to the economy. Obviously, depending on the city, there are lots of other factors contributing to that lower productivity, but we do know that poor transport connectivity is kind of a big part of some of the broader economic problems we see for our cities. Next slide, please. Obviously, you might be thinking now, perhaps this is a matter of choice. Maybe people simply don't want to commute by public transport. And obviously, there's always going to be an element of that. But what the data tells us is that it's just not necessarily possible for people in UK cities because they have poor public transport accessibility. So going back to that measure of how many people can reach the city centre in 30 minutes, we know that all of our cities have poor public transport accessibility compared to European comparators, except for Glasgow, which you can see there, it's third from the right, is just below the European average. But if you look at the share, for example, for Manchester, about just under 20% of people can reach a city centre in 30 minutes. And for a similar sized city in Europe, the average is 50%. And taking all the categories of cities, so everything from 750,000 people to 1 million people in this case, the overall average is just 40% of people within 30 minutes for UK cities versus 67% for EU cities. And if you run this data again, I don't have a chart in the PowerPoint, but for a 45-minute commuting time, which is obviously realistic in a lot of the larger cities, you get broadly the same averages. So our cities are performing poorly compared to their European counterparts. Next slide, please. So why is it that the accessibility is so poor or comparing so poorly compared to Europe? You might be thinking at this point that it's because our networks are poor. They're not long enough, there's not enough stations, etc. And in some cases, there's true, but there's actually two main factors that determine how many people can easily access public transport. And the first, what we're talking about when we say the network could be bigger, it could be better, is kind of how much area, geographic area, is covered by the network. But the second, which is kind of how we approach thinking about transport connectivity in cities, is how many people live within the catchment area. So you can increase the number of people that live within a catchment area by increasing residential density. And what you find out when you look at that density in the UK compared to Europe is that our networks are not necessarily smaller than European counterparts. In fact, 5 of the 9 big cities outside of London have networks that are pretty similar to European cities, but you have much lower residential densities. So if you look at this map here, you can see public transport in Birmingham, that's the green grid, has a much larger network than the public transport network in Lyon. That's the kind of pink filled in color, but that's the same number of residents. So Lyon has a much more concentrated city centre. They need a much smaller network to serve the same number of people. So what this tells us is that one of the big barriers facing public transport and the people wanting to use it in our cities is simply how dense they are. And not only does density make it hard for people to access the network, it also makes it very hard to run a viable network. It's going to be more expensive to build, expand, operate, all of that. And it also informs how we think about improving the network and about modal shift, because it's not simply going to be, and I say simply, but simply going to be a matter of adding a new bus or a new station. However, the flip side of this is that you have a real, what's the word? There's real potential to take advantage of the networks that we already have, the infrastructure that's already there, by approaching it by kind of increasing the density around those stations. Next slide, please. So what is the size of the prize here? This is kind of our headline finding from the Gearshift report that this presentation is all about. But if our 10 largest cities matched their European counterparts, it would be nearly 1 million people able to travel within 30 minutes by public rather than private transport. And that would double the number of people who are currently using public transport. So that's kind of the potential total pool of kind of people, the modal shift you could achieve here if you looked at improving accessibility. But so how would we go about doing this? Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is the framework that we set out in Gearshift for how you could look at achieving this kind of modal shift. And in the report, we go through lots and lots of case studies from places around the world. I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but if there's anything where you'd like to find out more, please do pop it in the Q&A and we can come back to it at the end. But I'll introduce a couple of the carrot and stick measures that can help achieve modal shift. And I'll specifically focus on the densification and how we can achieve that, as I think that's kind of the unique angle that we at Centre Cities really add to the debate around modal shift. Next slide, please. So, as I introduced, we can look at improving accessibility by densifying around public transport infrastructure. And this is a recognized form of development. It's called transit-oriented development. You can plan new developments, new housing around existing transport connections. And it's already recognized, for example, in the London plan, where they look at stations with additional capacity and they are trying to increase the number of people in the new developments around those. And we did, if you'd like to find out more about this piece of work, a couple of years ago now, called Homes on the Right Tracks, about using greenbelt land around kind of suburban or semi-rural stations for new developments, how many people you could put within 45-minute travel times of our cities. But looking at an example from abroad, you have the case of Lille in France, which uses a policy called the DVAT. That stands for Disc de Valorisation des Axes de Transport. And I'm really sorry if anybody speaks French on this. I clearly do not. But those are 500-meter zones centered on tram stops where you have special planning measures. For example, specifying the minimum density, emphasis on mixed-use development, and kind of active travel infrastructure. And that means you're kind of setting the people living in those zones up to be able to easily access public transport. And as well as doing this throughout the Lille area, when the city was looking to redevelop Lille Europe Station, they focused on making it an intermodal hub. So it had connections with kind of bus terminal and also like bike parking, things like that. And at the same time as that redevelopment, they launched an intermodal ticketing and fare caps to make those modal changes during the journeys easier. And what you saw as they did this is that residential density around the station increased. So for the 800 meters around the station, it went up to 39 residents per hectare. And that's compared to the average density of just 18 residents per hectare in the surrounding area. And the passengers also increased from around 3,300 per day back in 2005 up to 5,000 people per day in 2012. But the reason that the city was able to do this is that cities and places in France have more powers available to them due to decentralization than cities do here. And specifically, they have something, again, apologies for my French, called the versement transport, which is a kind of tax that they can use to raise money specifically for public transport improvements. And this gives them relative financial freedom to kind of make choices around transit-oriented development. In the UK, it's not always possible because we have a much more centralized system and local authorities and combined authorities don't necessarily have access to those kind of powers. And you also have here a discretionary planning system where case-by-case decision-making makes it just incredibly hard to get new developments off the ground. But it's not impossible. Combined authorities increasingly do have powers. So obviously, London is kind of the furthest down this line and they do have the London plan, but Greater Manchester also now has access to some spatial planning powers. And aside from that, councils can use something called local development orders. Next slide, please. And the other reason that densification policies, that kind of transit-oriented development, can be really important is it can also act as a source of revenue to fund further public transport improvements. And we'll come back to this later on, but obviously funding is a massive issue, and improvements are really important because it becomes very politically hard to do anything to disincentivize car use if you haven't introduced some improvements first. And when you're densifying, when you're developing land around station, you can use revenue generation mechanisms like land value capture, development tax, and tax increment financing to raise funds. So, for example, in Hong Kong, the mass transit system allows the operator to develop land around stations. So in 2019 in Hong Kong, for every pound collected from ticket revenue, a further 60 pence came from either property rental or management inside station. So it's a pretty substantial chunk of their revenue. And in Montreal, that's the little light rail you can see in the bottom picture, they're currently expanding that light rail, and they partly using a development tax to fund. So around 600 million Canadian dollars out of the total project value of 6.9 billion Canadian dollars is expected to come from land value capture that's levied on developers. And then again, in London, the Northern Line extension to Battersea and Nine Elms was financed using tax increment financing. Next slide, please. So let's say you're a city, you've successfully managed to densify around some of your stations, you've got more people within easy reach of the existing network. Now you want to capture even more people. You're thinking about what you can do to improve that network and make it a more appealing choice, more convenient vis-a-vis car transport. And this is where your carrot policies come in. And I'm kind of grouping them together here, but you basically have improvements, integration, and expansion. So passengers are not just sensitive to the price of tickets, they're also very sensitive to factors such as the distance your public transport stop, the time or distance when changing, say from bus to train, and the number of times you have to purchase tickets. So people prefer to just purchase once. Apologies if you hear construction noise outside. They prefer to just purchase once, even if that price is the same. Sorry, very inconvenient time for people outside to decide to do some building work. So cities can look to address these barriers by better integrating their network, making sure that if you get off a bus at a hub, you can hop straight onto the train. And if you kind of live outside of London, you come to London, this is very noticeable because it is just so easy to tap in and out with your Oyster card or, thank you very much, with your bank card. This is much easier said than done, unfortunately, and this is particularly the case in the UK because you have that very fragmented system. So you have lots of different private operators, you have lots of different local authorities working with them, and you don't tend to have like regional transport bodies like Transport for London or like the bodies that you see overseas able to manage that integration. That's something we'll look at a little bit later. But again, like the spatial planning powers, you're starting to see this take off in the UK. And this is a really positive sign because what a lot of the combined authorities are now able to do is progress bus franchising, which allows local government, the combined authority, or transport bodies like Transport for Greater Manchester or the West Midlands to specify the routes, the service frequencies, and the fares. And when they do it versus an operator doing it, it means they can actually think about integration rather than purely which services are most commercially viable. And it also allows them to do cross-subsidization, so to take the revenue for more profitable routes and subsidize those routes that might be socially necessary or really important for connecting people to services but are not necessarily profitable. And you see London do this where they use revenue from the tube to subsidize the bus network. Next slide, please. So obviously that's been achieved in London. So they've now had Transport for London for 20 years, and we're seeing that progress taking off in, say, Birmingham, Greater Manchester. But now talk to you a little bit about what this could look like for Glasgow, not just because I'm from Glasgow, but because we've done a lot of work modelling around what improving that integration would look like in Glasgow. And it's interesting because it's a really good example of the connection between network size and density. So it actually has a geographically large network by UK standards and by European averages as well. You've got heavy rail, you've got the subway, you can see the Kiwi map in the top right there, and you've also got a pretty extensive bus network. But you can see the stats there, it's not very dense. So there's not actually that many people living within that network zone, so 30-minute travel time. And like the rest of the UK, Glasgow's system, bus system I'm talking about, was deregulated and privatised kind of back in the 70s. So at the moment you have around 40 operators with integration. And yeah, I mean, I'm from Glasgow, but please, nobody ask me about the 77 different fare zones because I really cannot tell you about them. I don't understand how they work, and I suspect I'm not the only one. And then also in Glasgow, you have pretty low levels of car ownership. So less than half of the population have access to a private car. So at the moment, you've got 880,000, just under 1 million residents well connected to the urban core. So how could this change? Next slide, please. So we're defining well connected in this case by talking about people who can reach the urban core in 30 minutes using just a single mode, bus or rail, and with relatively good service frequencies. For trains, it's 2 trains an hour, and for bus, it's 4 buses an hour. So if you look at the map, the urban core is that pale green color, and then the current area can access the urban core within 30 minutes is the darker green color. So if you were to simply add more buses, improve the frequency, you would expand to that kind of purpley blue color you can see on the map. And that would add the number of people who are well connected, would increase by around 24%, or 210,000 people. And if you then went on to integrate modes, so make it easier for people to change from rail to subway at the same ticket price, you would add a further 90,000 people well connected to the urban core. And this is, of course, modeling. You don't know that people would necessarily take advantage of those opportunities. It's obviously easier said than done. So just to note the example from TransLink Australia, you can see at the bottom, that's a kind of polycentric urban area serving Brisbane, Gold Coast, and the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. It's about 3.8 million people. And they did a large project to integrate the network kind of back in the early 2000s, where they switched from 18 different operators to one single body, TransLink. TransLink gained control of the fares. It launched integrating ticketing and a relatively simple zone system with just 8 fare zones. And what they've seen since then is 3.5% increase in ridership. And that's attributed directly to the launch of integrated ticketing, making it easier for people to change modes. So examples like TransLink in Australia and other ones that you can find in the report do show us that integration, simple, from the user experience, that is, as, a tap in, tap out ticket can have a really big positive impact on how many people use transport. So next slide, please. And now to move on to the stick policies. I think everyone really likes to talk about the carrots. People are generally behind improvements, but the reality is that we will need policies for sticks to disincentivize car use if we are to make public transport competitive against the private car and to fund some of those improvements. So the first main lever, and this is referring to like a whole raft of policies that cities could choose from here, is road pricing. And that can include things like car parking charges, congestion charges, low emission zone, clean air zone, road user charging. The politics of these, as I'm sure we all well know, means that they tend to be grouped together as either pro-public transport, so making it public transport better, for example, congestion charging so that people can actually get through, or depending on your view, as just kind of anti-driving, war on motorist policies. But they're actually all quite discrete policies with discrete aims. For example, congestion charging, obviously very specifically aimed at congestion, whereas if you really wanted to address, for example, emissions, you would need to look at clean air zones and target specific groups. So for example, higher emitting vehicles, you might want to target only peak time commuting. You might want to have exemptions for businesses, etc. And the other important thing I think that is often missed in some of the debate and the politics around these is that they're not, although they do raise some revenue-making mechanisms primarily. So first of all, it's very costly to implement most of these policies. When you look at kind of the costs involved in the ULEZ expansion in London, those are massive and you have ongoing operational costs. And revenue tends to fall over time as compliance improves. And cities know that from the outset because the compliance improving is, it's a sign of success. It means that you're having your lower emissions, you're reducing congestion, people are giving up older vehicles, etc. Next slide, please. The other kind of broad tranche of measures that cities have to think about disincentivizing car use is aimed at addressing ownership and parking. So where you have road pricing, which simply addresses the cars when they're moving, these are policies that are aimed at tackling car usage at the source. So these could include things like workplace parking levies, ownership permits, and proof of parking. So to take an example from Japan, they have something called Shago Shomei. It means proof of parking, where when you purchase a car, you need to prove that you have parking within 2 kilometers of your home. This is very effective because it encourages smaller cars, because people want to be able to park their car on the property rather than needing to rent a larger space elsewhere. And it also creates a market which specifically disincentivizes car use in cities, because land values are higher. People do not want to pay the costs of parking in cities, whereas in more rural areas where land values are lower, paying for a parking space is not that much of a barrier. So it means you're not kind of excessively penalizing people in those more rural areas where they need to rely on private car transport. And this is complemented by, in Tokyo, a ban on on-street parking. So you can't simply say, I'll park near my house on the street. The fine is really hefty. It's around £1,000. Obviously, there is context here. Tokyo and the rest of Japan is extremely dense. It has small streets. I think it's 86% of streets are not even wide enough for a car to stop without blocking the flow of traffic behind. Car ownership overall is incredibly expensive. You have much higher MOT costs and much higher kind of insurance costs. And then you also have special category of cars, like a kind of light vehicle, which means you have really small cars. It's easier to park on your property, but it's nevertheless a really good policy because it creates that market where you're not penalizing people who do rely on cars to the same extent. And then going to a UK example, Nottingham is actually the only place in the UK that operates a workplace parking levy. The workplace parking levy is another really good example of a policy because it's fairly cost effective to set up and maintain. In the scheme of things, what you essentially need is a database, a map of employers, and in the case of Nottingham, it's employers with 11 or more parking spaces. And then you need the kind of yearly administration. But unlike policies like the ULEZ, you don't need kind of the technological infrastructure in terms of number plate tracking and things like that. And it's also effective because it kills 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. You're not only disincentivizing private car commuting to work, you are also raising revenue. So Nottingham has used the revenue from the workplace parking levy to fund improvements to their transport network. And you can see from the numbers here that they've managed to raise quite a lot of revenue over the years the policy is operational. And if you go to the report, we also looked into kind of how much further investment it brings in. And I would have to double check this, but I think something like for every £1 that it brought in of revenue from the workplace parking levy, they got another £3 to £4 of match funding from the government because it really proves that the city has a commitment to public transport. Next slide, please. So just to highlight the example of Singapore as a place that's kind of brought a whole raft of these car disincentivization measures together. So on the road pricing side of things, they have what is, I would say, the most advanced example in the world, road user charging, brought in after decades of kind of congestion charging style. You enter a zone and you pay a toll, road pricing. Vehicles in the city-state now have in-vehicle units, so they're automatically charged when they go through this gantry that you can see in the picture and enter the charging zone. But the charges vary according to the time of day, vehicle size, and specific use. And this allows the city to optimize road usage, so prices will actually go down if a road is underused. What they're aiming to do is make those roads used kind of as effectively as they can be. You can see from the numbers here that not only did it achieve traffic reduction in the CBD, but it's also a fairly large contributor to the local transport authorities' revenues. It's about 10% in the 2010s. Next slide, please. But any revenue generated from the electronic road pricing kind of pales in comparison to those ownership side measures. So in Singapore, that is primarily the certificate of entitlement, which is a car ownership permit. So in order to cap the rise in vehicles in the city-state at 3% each year, and obviously the context of Singapore being a city-state and being extremely dense is important here, they operate a permit system by auction. And you can see that the average cost is high. So it's £60,000 average for a 10-year permit, with some concessions for greener vehicles. And that revenue, 4.1 billion for the 2021 revenue. It's a huge contributor to the money that the local transport authority has to invest in public transport. The only kind of disadvantage of this policy that you see in Singapore is obviously that more well-off people, the cost of the permit is fairly minimal. So you see it being skewed towards the better off. Next slide, please. So I think that brings me to the end of the presentation side of things. Obviously, I only introduced a few of the case studies that you find in the report, but we can cover any of them Q&A and all the links at the end. But in terms of key takeaways, I mean, Graham really set this up at the beginning, and I hope that I've covered it too. We need to care about public transport, not just, for its own sake or for net zero. It really matters for the economy, for access to skills, for not just the economies of those local places, but also for our national GDP and productivity gap. And it isn't just a matter of our ridership declining. It was already at a low baseline, so we shouldn't simply be aiming to get back to pre-COVID levels or back to kind of early 2000 levels. Idealistically, we need to be aiming to get on par with European counterpart cities. And in order to achieve that, it isn't just about expanding networks or improving services, although obviously those are important. You can set those policies up for success by changing the way we think about transport. So we need to match residential density with transport connections. We need to densify around that infrastructure that's already there and enable more people to live close to public transport and live close to the urban core. And then once you have that understanding, you can really set policies up for success, and that includes both the carrot policies and the stick policies. And the main barrier that I would say, and that Centre for Cities would say, to that happening in the UK isn't, funding is a huge issue, but it's the lack of powers for local government to make some of those development decisions. And it's the lack of regional transport bodies like, for example, the Singapore Transport Authority, who are able to lead on those integrated improvements and take that kind of holistic approach to the network. So I think that's it from the presentation, although, we have a QR code here for our mailing list, which is the best way to stay up to date with all the research blogs, podcasts I mentioned. Obviously, you'll be able to scan that when the team at Mobility's Way send out the slides. And on the final slide, you'll see all the links to some of the research that's gone into this presentation.
Fabulous. Thank you, Caitlin. Fascinating. Great to see some global case studies and the like. Just while we do a bit of sifting of questions received, and maybe give people another minute or so to add any others, some information on webinars. Actually, before this one, Centre for Cities have one at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So Caitlin mentioned sticks. Well, Centre for Cities are providing a short presentation on how road pricing is being used overseas, followed by a panel discussion on the benefits and drawbacks to road pricing and its future in UK cities. So that's this afternoon at 1 o'clock. So if you want to, I think the link to register has been added to the chat for those interested to learn some more over lunch. And then, as you can see in front of you, we have a webinar in a fortnight's time. So we typically try, as I say, trying to get into a rhythm of doing these every fortnight on a Thursday at 11. So our next one is on the 13th of June, where we'll be taking a deep dive into parking policy at universities and how to hopefully satisfy sustainability and financial objectives. The link to that one is also going to get stuck in the chat. Okay, so on to questions. There's quite a few coming through, which is fantastic. Um, I just maybe start one, Caitlin. You mentioned sticks. How can we get politicians and the public behind stick measures like low emission zones?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's no easy answer to it. I think anything I say is certainly not gonna, solve that problem. And I can already see some of the questions in the Q&A referencing how hard it can be in more rural areas to get around resistance to those stick policies. But I think there's a couple of common themes that emerge from the case studies if you go away and read the report. So the first thing, and I know it's easier said than done, is you need to make improvements before you can start introducing those stick policies. You need to provide relatively viable alternatives. So it was no coincidence in London that Sadiq Khan and TfL launched the Superloop. That's an outer London kind of bus service connection around the same time as they were expanding the ULEZ. And you also see, for example, I'm afraid I don't remember off the top of my head, I believe it was Slovenia, but I may be wrong, I'm afraid. But cities in Europe where they're introducing what's the word, like car-free hours within the day. You had a mayor introduce that. It was kind of initial policy, phase two use resistance, but people do come round to these once they see the benefits in terms of, quality of life, air quality, etc. And he was re-elected subsequently. So you can take that kind of approach if possible. The other thing you can do is really focus on communication. So again, looking at London, Sadiq Khan, especially in first and second term, really focused on the communications around air quality and pollution. Obviously, his book is called Breathe. It's kind of all about that, and it's highlighted internationally as examples of what cities can do on air quality. And then you also really need to focus on communicating around any stick policies you're bringing in. So Singapore and the government in Singapore can, within reason, do whatever it wants. It didn't necessarily need to communicate its road pricing policies, but it did, I think, at least 12 months of kind of public engagement campaigns around electronic road pricing. And when you're doing these, you can also make it really clear that they are not primarily aimed at raising revenue. They are not a tax for the city. They're there to address air quality, to reduce emissions, etc. But yeah, that I'm afraid is easier said than done. But that's, I think, some of the common themes that emerge.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Superloop. I mean, one of the questions, the latest one came through actually, it talks about how do cities best tackle suburban or cross-city travel? And actually, so there is an example of actually recognizing the fact that traffic or transport in and to the centre is pretty strong, but perhaps around the edges not so strong. So there is one thing that I think all cities should be considering. I think it's a very valid point. It's all very well tackling that piece of it, but if you can't get people moving between in the outer regions as well, you've got a problem. Some other bits that were interesting for me. So there's densification aspect. So a few questions around that. And it's interesting from us because obviously Mobility Ways, we're very much focused on behaviour change in terms of how people move. I guess there's also a big piece here about behaviour change in the way we live. I mean, as much as it can be, densification can be added to transport nodes and intercities. Do we have a problem here in the UK that that's not what we want to, that's not how most people want to live, or the dream of how you live is you move to the suburbs to a house and have 2.4 children and perhaps 2.4 cars. What do you think to that?
I think that's certainly true. I mean, it's part of a broader problem, which we'd need probably a whole other day of webinars for, in that the UK simply doesn't build enough houses, whether they're in the suburbs or in the city centre. And our kind of big central city stat is that we are missing 3.4 million homes when you, 4.3, sorry, 4.3 million homes if you compare house building levels between the UK and EU since the post-war. But what we try to communicate when we're talking about densification, and I think what the examples, especially from Europe, show, is there is certainly a bit of it's almost like rebranding and marketing that needs to be done here in the UK. Because I think when people say density, and possibly rightly so, there's a little bit of a gut reaction where we're thinking about high rise and we're thinking about places that people really don't want to live. And when you look at density in the EU, we're talking kind of like 4 or 5 floors of those very classic, for example, like Parisian or Barcelona style apartment blocks with maybe courtyards or green spaces. Obviously, it's an ideal world. It's very different from the urban form that we currently have, but density doesn't necessarily have to mean no access to private green space, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean high-rise living either. And even that level of density would, hugely increase the number of people that you have around stations.
Yeah, I like it. Thank you. There's an interesting comment here from Paul Robeson about Copenhagen has a very successful strategy of reducing on-street car parking by 2% a year, a politically acceptable number, but with a huge cumulative effect. Do we know of any other cities that have tried this? I mean, I've not heard of this, and I think that's actually seems like quite a pragmatic, maybe it's a Scandinavian type approach to things, quite a pragmatic sort of win-win. Don't make it too big, but make it sufficient that actually over a period of some years, it makes quite a difference.
Yeah, so, well, the first thing I would say is one of the other common themes that emerges from a lot of our work on transport is just look to Scandinavia. They're broadly doing a really good job. Um, but yeah, so one of the ones that I think comes up briefly in the Gear Shift report is the Netherlands. I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but they're also looking to reduce the number of parking spaces in the city. They don't have a percentage target that I know of. They are doing it kind of under the auspices of parking spaces specifically around canals in areas that need a bit of work for general, construction and safety. And I think the policy is that when work is done, they will simply not replace the parking space, which again is a fairly good way because instead of saying we're going to remove this parking space, you're saying we're going to do some construction to make your canal area safer, and then you just don't replace it. It's possibly a little bit sneaky, but it's also quite effective. And then again in Paris, I'm sure lots of you will have seen how much they're doing around public transport and specifically cycling infrastructure in the last few years and in the run up to the Olympics. And they are halving the number of parking spaces. So it's from 140,000 down to 70,000. Lots of that is being replaced with bike storage or with green spaces.
That's interesting because a thought in my mind is that there are still too many cars in cities. I mean, you mentioned Glasgow and car ownership being under 50%, but there's still physically too many vehicles kicking around in cities. And I wonder, under the maybe it's carrot, maybe there's more that could be done by cities to actually be even more innovative and creative about how they get there. So, for example, in the UK, Coventry had a scrappage scheme going to get rid of some older vehicles out of the car park and replace them with some credits that people could use for different types of solutions. I'm wondering if cities need to go further and say, we will pay you to get this car out of there because actually we want the parking space. We want to be able to support active travel and the like. So we've got to try and come up with a win-win. Or is there other options? I mean, potentially, could we be saying you can have a car, you've got to park it outside the town. We're going to put areas where you can put a car, potentially take it out away from outside the house, so that actually you only really use it when you need it for a longer trip. And maybe there's some carrots around it. Maybe you get free MOT, free tax by doing so.
Yeah, and I think that will definitely think both those options will be there for different areas. So for like those denser city centre areas where public transport and active transport can be kind of a good option for large groups of people, you might look at those credits. So you had that in Barcelona. They offered a kind of scrappage scheme where if you traded in an older, more emitting vehicle, I think it was a year of free transport with something called a T-Verda card, which is basically an Oyster style card. But then you also have, I think, for more suburban areas where you are still going to need a car for some journeys, that like out of town parking option. And there's a few towns, I believe it's Freiburg in Germany that has that where you have like a car free core in the suburb, and then you have out of town parking for all of those private vehicles.
Great. There was a question around, it was a slightly data one, I think, Caitlin, in terms of what area is measured to come to the 30 minutes to the city type figure. Is it geographical population?
So it's the area that is as big as the like, so it's people. So the area marked on the map, for example, that Glasgow area, it's the share of people who can get in by 30 minutes. I'm afraid that isn't a very good explanation because, like I said, I'm not on the data team. But if more people could get there in 30 minutes, that area would then be bigger.
Right. I mean, just one thing from our side. So from a mobility ways perspective, we have quite a nice tool that supports large organizations understand the potential within their workforce to travel more sustainably. So that's using origin and destination data, accommodating for shift patterns to really show graphically those that could be using public transport. And to that point, public transport relative to the time that it would take them to use a car. So if it was taking 20 minutes, it's unlikely that you can change someone's behavior to travel by public transport if it's going to take, say, an hour. But if it's going to take around 40 minutes, so twice the time of the car, you've got an opportunity to perhaps change their behaviors. And that's some of the work that we do with very large organizations to help them visualize what the messages that they may then play to their organization to help them advance sustainable travel. I mean, I'm excited. There is this opportunity, as you've articulated, for pretty much 1 million people to travel through public transport. And if we think about the large cities, you mentioned Transport for Greater Manchester, you mentioned TfWM, these are cities that are investing heavily through bus franchising, and others will follow to increase public transport. The whole basis of this is to increase patronage on buses. And I think I've heard from several of those, commuting is where the growth is going to come from. So if you've got sort of one sort of key takeout to leave us with, there's loads of questions and we'll have to come back to people because I'm conscious of time. Is there, what is going to be the number one thing that really cities should be thinking about to kind of get to, maybe not 1 million, but maybe we'll get 100,000 more in the next couple of years?
I think I would have to return to densification because it just offers the opportunity to do so many things at once. You're using your existing transport infrastructure. You're not necessarily looking at expansions. You're putting more people within reach of that existing network. You're making that network more viable because you have more potential users. You are increasing your labor pool, the number of people who can get to jobs, who can get to education. You're reducing your carbon emissions because people are spending less time traveling. And I'm sure there's more things, but yeah, oh, that's right. The opportunity to potentially raise revenue by looking at kind of business rates, tax increment financing, all of those, you have the opportunity to generate money that you can then put back into further public transport improvements. So I know it's not an option for all of UK cities, or that it can be really resource insensitive if looking at stuff like local development orders, but that has to be the key takeaway from me.
And that needs powers, as you described. So do you feel that that opportunity may arise in the months to come?
Yeah, I think in the months to come. I mean, yeah, I can't speak for that, but I think either way, we're seeing it already growing because you've seen devolution really expand and really deepen over the last decade. And I think that's going to continue regardless of what happens in the next 2 months or the next 5 years, etc. And you've already seen, as you just touched on, big moves in regards to bus franchising in some of the combined authorities, and actually Glasgow as well, so the devolved nations. So I think there is, small cause for optimism there, despite all of the kind of broader issues. And I can see some of them in the Q&A around reliability and funding and the issues facing public transport users.
Yeah, I think devolution has got a massive part to play. That the powers at local areas with those who are in touch with their local communities. I guess in the absence of densification, because obviously planning takes time, buildings take time, a more data-led approach for me would be an important way to look at this. We've got lots of buses, we've got a network that perhaps isn't as utilised as much as it could be. We need to better understand, who could be sitting on those buses, and make it easier for people to take them by kind of perhaps influencing more, incentivizing them through their workforce. So exciting times. Thank you so much, Caitlin. We'll leave it there. As I say, there were lots of questions, but I think some of them deserve a fuller answer over email. So for now, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and please do come along to our road pricing webinar in an hour if you would like to. Thank you very much for having me today.
Great. Bye.